With The Acolyte now finished, if you were a fan of the show but haven't made your way into the big world of Star Wars books, you may be wondering where you can start. So today we're going to be going over a few good options if you're looking for either similar subject matter or themes to The Acolyte, in both the Legends and Disney canon continuities. Aside from direct narrative connections, I'm primarily looking at this from the perspective of stories about the Jedi or Sith as organizations and what their role in the galaxy might mean. Also, what their impact on the individuals within those organizations might mean. The first recommendation I have keeps us within the Disney canon, but comes from an author who will be pretty familiar to longtime Legends readers. This is The Living Force by John Jackson Miller, a pretty recent release. This story, set before The Phantom Menace, explores all of the members of the Phantom Menace-era Jedi Council as they try to assess the withdrawal of the Jedi as an active presence in the galaxy, examining the role of the Order in the Republic and the galaxy at large. It also has a storyline about the ethics and methods around how the Jedi acquire their students, much like The Acolyte does, though with some different perspectives on the matter. Second is a Legends novel, which provided a lot of the inspiration for what went into The Acolyte in terms of the show's background lore. This is Darth Plagueis by James Luceno. This book is among my favorites across all of Star Wars, and if you want to understand anything about how the Sith functioned leading into Palpatine's rise to power, this is a great place to get that. Plagueis himself gets a brief cameo in The Acolyte, and while the novel is no longer canon, locations from the book like Baldemnik and its Cortosis mine, as well as many other details like keeping Plagueis a Mun, were clearly inspired by this book. So if you want to read more about that background and just have a fun Sith story, this is a great place to look. Since Luceno has so many references to other works in his own writing, this can also set you up for a fun series of Easter eggs if you move on to other books afterwards. For our third recommendation, we get to something with a lot of pure narrative connections, but also some thematic parallels. This is the High Republic series of books and comics in the Disney canon. These books show the Jedi at their height, but also cover what starts setting them down into the situation we see in the prequel era, with the Acolyte bridging that gap. Similarly to our first example, The Living Force, it centers on the Jedi either individually or as an organization finding their place and exploring how their flaws may work in the context of the Jedi as an institution, or at least examining what the Jedi might call flaws. It's also where you learn the origins of Vernestra Rwoh and her light whip. There's a lot of books in this series, and the main plot isn't done yet, but I might actually suggest, if people don't want to make that big of a commitment right off the bat, that you actually start with Phase 2 novels, Convergence and Cataclysm. This duology takes place significantly before the Phase 1 and 3 books, but while it's setting up context for those, and this is technically reading it out of order, I think the story told in that pair is easily digestible on its own and has some more direct parallels to The Acolyte. Jumping back to Legends and building on the Legends Sith information we're given by Plagueis, another option is the Darth Bane trilogy, which takes the timeline back to when Darth Bane first established the Rule of Two, and also the first time the Sith broke the Rule of Two, which was pretty much immediately. These books are a bit more on the edgy side and kind of take an RPG combat approach to the frequent but still fun lightsaber battles, so it's more of an option for learning the background on some of the lore which came through, even if the specifics don't apply in the new canon, rather than being a thematic match like some of these other recommendations. Now we'll get back to some of those thematic matches, and we'll be staying within Legends for the rest of them. First, for a Clone Wars option, there's Yoda Dark Rendezvous. This is a more personal story about the Jedi, covering Dooku and Yoda's relationship as master and apprentice, and how they, among other main characters of the book, handle their own connection to the light or the dark side. One of the other main characters, a Padawan named Scout, is dealing with the prospect of being kicked out of the Jedi Order. This isn't for the same reason that Osha left, but you can see her dealing with some of the same issues. There's another Master and Apprentice story in new canon called Master and Apprentice about Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, but I haven't read that, so I can't really recommend it. I'm just generally less familiar with what it's actually about. Then we have I, Jedi, set in the post-Endor period. This book actually includes a different perspective on the events of a different set of novels, the Jedi Academy trilogy, where Luke is initially setting up his new order. The perspective we're given is Corran Horns, who's actually not in those original books at all. But while this book is a bit weird in some uncomfortably thirsty ways, which author Michael Stackpole does address with the character of Corran in later works, it does a good job of covering some of the philosophy of what Luke is trying to do with the Order and his own power. And along with the Hand of Thrawn duology, we get to see Luke step back and reconsider some of how he's teaching his students. A lot of authors at this point actually were engaging with the idea that Luke is just some superhero and maybe we need to tone that back. Maybe there's something wrong with how much he's relying on the Force. We also got a bit of a wider view of the Force with the introduction of the Jensari, a splinter group of Force users from the time of the Clone Wars, who use armor made out of a fun new material called Cortosis, which can short out lightsabers. So there's a lot of little Acolyte connections and parallels in here. My final recommendation for today continues on the theme of alternate Force traditions like those we see with the witches on Brendok, and it goes back to the original introduction, at least the original intentional one, of the Night Sisters who inspired those witches on Brendok, the courtship of Princess Leia. This story is about how Han and Leia ended up getting married, but more importantly we have the witches and the Night Sisters on Dathomir, two new traditions using a different interpretation of the Force or something very like it. There's also some parallels to the anti-colonial themes of the Acolyte in here. I was very tempted to include the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy in this list because of their use of the Falinasi, another female-only Force sect with a very different set of powers, and one who directly interacts with and challenges Luke's actions as a Jedi, especially his use of violence in so many situations. This happens in the context of searching for hints of who his mother was, thinking that his mother was one of them, so you can kind of go into the story at this point knowing that it leads nowhere. This was written long before we knew who Padme was, but this would be an even harder recommendation for me to make than the New Rebellion was in my Andor video, since the Falinasi plot, while I think it's relevant here, is basically a C-plot in the Black Fleet Crisis, which otherwise tends to skew a fair bit more towards hard sci-fi. So while the other plots do actually have a bit more of the colonialism angle, I think the tone may be just too different to truly recommend it here. And I honestly find the portrayal of Leia in the books to be outright uncomfortable to read, but I went back and forth on it enough that I feel like I should at least mention it as a possibility here. That's it for today's recommendations though, thank you for watching, let me know if there's anything you think should or shouldn't have been on this list. Next up, we'll probably be doing Ahsoka.